In a world with academics and celebrities warning about robots taking over the world and conspiracy theories being spread that COVID was perpetuated by 5G networks, the last thing that we need is children's media repeating this fear that is already being extremely reified in the way that we approach technology and science. Model and characterization, and then two arguments. Firstly, when we get science fiction that is substantially more enjoyable, provides better escapism, and will have far better thematic elements. And then secondly, like if you buy that this motion is about large scientific impacts, we are better for that as well. Getting into our model and characterization. So firstly, I think that teams either have to defend one or the other. Hopkins say we support a combination of both media. In terms of what utopias look like, it's not just everyone running around free and jolly. There often is some commentary about how society was able to endure hardships and get to that particular point. There are still hardships that individual characters face, stuff like that. The first claim that we want to make is that science fiction is going to provide substantially more joy to people under our side of the house. The first thing that I want to do here is a lot of framing about why we think that this is the most relevant impact in the round, and like large-scale mega scientific impacts are not actually that likely to occur. The first reason for this is that this media is often catered toward children and younger teens who are very, very young, who lack the kind of political capital to influence like scientific investment and stuff like that. Secondly, a lot of people, especially older ones who do have this political capital, are able to engage in a cognitive dissonance that these kinds of narratives are not necessarily real. So they're able to identify that if magic AI is taking over the world, that's not going to be a reality when we wake up tomorrow or the next day. Thirdly, people tend to consume a lot of other media that also concern science. So these are just things like public academics, people like Elon Musk, who talk about these issues for substantial periods of time. And the final thing to say is that like the people who actually invent tech are fairly removed from the networks of people who watch these shows. So I doubt like a science fiction book is going to influence whether someone manufactures AI in ways that have better moral codes or worse moral codes. Therefore, what we posit on opening government is that the most important thing that we should care about is just maximizing potential enjoyment that people are able to get from media, given that other benefits are a lot more likely to be minor in this debate. I think that we're going to extract a lot more joy from sci-fi media under our side of the house for a couple of reasons. The first thing to say is that media that we get is substantially more escapist. The world that we live in right now is fairly shit, right? Like COVID causes anxiety for a lot of people. Climate change causes anxiety for a lot of people. And we just have a lot of daily stressors in our lives that I think are quite miserable. I think a lot of people get a lot of joy from scientific media. And what distinguishes this kind of media from like reality shows is that you're able to immerse yourself in a new world, in a new reality that can remove you from the difficult conditions of the current struggles that you face, right? So these are things like actually seeing like a dystopia where everyone is running around and happy, and you can get lost in the joy of a lot of these shows that I just think can bring people kind of happiness they do not have tangibly in their lives necessarily. I think that secondly, broader thematic elements that are going to occur within utopias are just substantially better than the kind of things that we're going to get in dystopias. This is because when you have a world that is ruined, you often situate these narratives on characters who are able to survive. And in order to construct viable narratives about who are able to survive, this is often disproportionately on like privileged people. So when it comes to shows on Netflix like Snowpiercer, it was primarily about people who had money to be able to buy train tickets and stuff like that. On the other hand, we would posit that utopias have far better narratives because it's often about how humanity as a whole was collectively able to rise from incredibly difficult situations. We were able to reconfigure how we actually identities when you have things like different groups of people who may have fought a war historically but are able to bond together, and it's easier to get screen time for different kinds of demographics as opposed to a group who had the wealth to like buy a particular plane or to buy a train and actually exit this utopia. So I think that we've framed why these are the most realistic impacts in the round, but even if you do not buy that, I want to get into our second argument about how we get better kinds of innovation and stuff like that. Before that, just closing opposition, have a POI.
How are you supposed to market something so that people can know it's escapist? Do you just say we win in the end?
I'm confused. You just market it as being like a very positive world. I think people are drawn to these things like Harry Potter, right? Because it's like a magical world that people are drawn to. Okay, how do we get better kinds of science and innovation? Basically, our claim here is that our natural psychological tendencies are always going to be very averse and fearful of technological change that we were able to get. There are a few reasons why this characterization is true. The first thing to say is that people on a psychological level fear change. This is due to the fact that newness is associated with scariness. It's associated with the unknown. The only thing that we can be certain about in our lives is the material conditions that exist around us, and therefore de facto bias is always going to be to resort to the present, and it's easy to demonize change because we do not know particular things that might go in the future. The second thing to say here is that there are already plenty of academics and high profile people like Elon Musk who warn about the dangers of particular kind of sciences. There are a lot of papers that have been written about the dangers of AI taking over our world. There are a lot of people internally within the AI community who warn about these particular things. People who know a lot about climate change being dangerous have been very vocal about these these particular kind of issues. So within the public eye, we just are aware of a lot of these things. The third thing to say is that people have very poor understanding of the way that technology works. This is precisely why people in the United States, as I mentioned in my intro, thought that 5G networks were literally spreading COVID-19. When you have a poor understanding of how tech works, it becomes a lot easier for conspiracy theories surrounding tech to ultimately emerge, because lies become a lot more persuasive too when you lack that complex understanding of how algorithms are actually able to function. The final mechanism for this is that people have had firsthand experiences with technological change not necessarily going well. We're scared of the NSA spying on us with the fancy new cameras that we get. We've read The Economist articles about facial recognition technology within China being able to actively spy on civilians. We know that there have been things like horrible industrial accidents. There are papers about how life was better before the Industrial Revolution, where automation was taking the jobs away from people. Because we were scared about automation, because we were scared about privacy, there was already so much pre-existing fear. What then are the two impacts to extend from this characterization? The first thing to say is that under the status quo, there is too much skepticism, and it is bad to feed into this to an even larger extent. We think that innovation that occurs could sometimes be really, really good. For example, you might need things like geoengineering technology to fight climate change because it's the only option that we have. Forms of very, very smart artificial intelligence could help people with disabilities lead better quality of lives. I think, however, we're going to have anti-innovative tendencies if you feed into our pre-existing fear that things are just going to get substantially worse going into the future. So therefore, it's actually important to shift our societal biases in favor of innovation, such that if we need to, we can access positive benefits of AI, like using it to be able to fight climate change or help people who really need that. But secondly, in order to fight various issues that Op is going to talk about, like climate change, what you need people on the ground to actually think is that there is a form of hope. When you feed into individuals' doomsday mindset, it perpetuates the scenario, there is nothing that I can do because the world is going to turn to shit, the world is going to end anyways. Look at this media that I've recently seen. Whereas under our side of the house, when you see a utopia, people are going to be more hopeful about their future, which actually has a greater mobilizing effect in encouraging people to do things like fight climate change, because there is a better future for me and there is a better future for my family at the end of the day. For all of these reasons, I'm very proud to stand in opening government.
I thank that speaker for their remarks, and I invite the Leader of Opposition to open up the op-ed. Hear, hear.
Hello? Can everyone hear me?
Yes, you are audible.
Cool. I just want to draw everyone's attention to the sunrise here in the Asian time zone. It's 6:30 a.m. Great. We love it. Also, we're in finals, so I just want to say a quick thank you to everyone for hosting, running this tournament, judging, and also for Will for being a great partner. All that great stuff. Cool. All right. Oh, sorry. Let me get my timer. Okay. Time starts in 3, 2, 1. Now, I want to start by talking about the scope of the motion, which is that the motion states that they want content creators to exclusively create utopian literature, right? What does this mean? It means to the extent that like we still want some escapist literature on, maybe our side of the house, we can still access that. But what they have to defend is the idea of not having any of these more nuanced, more negative, more like more critical critiques of the future in dystopian literature. We think that that's really bad because, like, first of all, we think we still get some of that escapist literature on our side of the house when people want it or when people feel that they need it. But we also just critique the idea that literature should exist to be escapist in the first place, right? Why do we value literature? Because we think that like it exists as an opportunity to give a powerful and like visceral and like somewhat exaggerated interpretation of reality in order to do things like stimulate people's imaginations, elicit strong reactions, and actually stimulate conversations around social or political issues that are happening in society, right? Recognize that not everybody like, reads the news and is like exposed to all these academics that OG talks about. We think that a lot of people do just like, consume Netflix, they read books, they, like consume all these sorts of media, and it's important to filter down the message to those people as well, right? Recognize also that like the value for literature to critique society is like oftentimes the impetus for creating social change, right? Think about how like like the adventures of Huckleberry Finn raised like sympathies against like slave owning in the South, or like the book Secret Garden helped like propel the feminist movement in like the 1950s and stuff like that. We think that dystopian literature allows you to access a lot of these similar conversations and like and far more in the political realm. Cool. The first point we're going to talk to you about is how dystopias critique the idea of ideological purity, and that all utopias are necessarily built off of, right? Recognize that a utopia must be based on some sort of ideology, because a utopia is definitionally something that is perfectly functioning, but also perfectly functioning in an unchanging way, right? That is to say that there's a certain amount of like, hopefulness, or a certain amount of comfort in knowing that like the perfect society that's described in the utopia is never going to be threatened by some sort of outsider, is never going to be threatened by some sort of just like environmental change in the conditions, is never going to be threatened by some sort of just like change in people's tastes and ideologies and the way people think, right? We think that like, this might look like something like communism, this might look like something like liberalism. We don't really like care about what specifically the ideology is in the utopia, but what we tell you is that any form of ideological purity is really, really bad and often fails in practice, and is probably not something that we should be encouraging, right? We think it's not worth pursuing an ideology because, like, first of all, most ideologies just like don't work perfectly in practice, even if it is the case that you can like imagine them working perfectly in some sort of utopian society. But even if it is the case that they do work perfectly, we tell you that they're always built off of some sort of suffering, right? That is to say that like, the communist revolution or whatever is always built off of the suffering of like, the violence that had to be done in order to get that revolution to that particular place. And like, it's always built on like the exclusion of others. That is to say, people that disagree with the commonly held beliefs that keep that utopia together for whatever reason, these people are excluded in society. And we also tell you that this comes at the exclusion of new ideas, right? New ideas that might potentially disagree with the ideas that like these utopias are built off of, right? We tell you that not only does dystopia avoid these tropes and avoid these, like negative tropes, but also that it actively critiques those tropes, right? Think about books like Brave New World, which actually start off seeming like utopias where everybody's like happy and, like literally having like orgasmic pleasure all the time, but then it digs beneath the surface and you realize that all of this is being held together by like, pills and chemicals controlled by the state and all that kind of stuff, right? And we see how this like not only functions as a dystopia, but it functions as a critique that maybe of the value that maybe like everybody should be happy all the time and all suffering is inherently, like bad, and like the state should be, existing as some sort of like entity to always make people feel happy and always make people like feel like their, lives are going great, right? So we can see that like, again, like, so we can see that a utopia that is absent that type of kind of like more negative outlook, that is absent that type of more pessimistic outlook, risks falling into the pitfalls of being like too rooted in a particular ideology. Yeah, CG.
Who do you think reads these books? Like,
okay, so this is an interesting question, but we would go further to say that like a lot of people in society probably like don't read books in the first place, but we would also say that like dystopians, because they're more negative and because they like attract a lot of sensationalist media attention, and because, and I'll get to this in my second point, they're often rooted in real life and often rooted in problems that exist right now. They generate an enormous amount of like conversation around those dystopian works, right? So we think like it is the case that like for both utopias and dystopias, especially for books, like not that many people actually like, read books and stuff, but we think that dystopias are better at generating a conversation around those stories and generating a conversation around that literature. Cool. Second point about how dystopias tend to be rooted in our current reality and how that manifests and how that like encourages people to be more critical and more aware of like things in our society right now that are going wrong. Right? What do I mean by this? First, the idea that tech is not unambiguously good, as opening government has tried to mention, right? Like, look at our world right now. We have things like segmented social media echo chambers creating more populism and more political polarization. We have things like, climate change threatening our ability to survive in the future. And we have things like nuclear war and nuclear proliferation threatening the existence of all of humanity, right? We think it's really, really important that books like 1984 that critique the existence of populism or idolizing a particular leader or defining your state or your community in opposition to some sort of enemy, which so often happens in society today, or books like movies like Interstellar that describe climate change as something that's going to be really, really bad in the near future, affecting people just like us, or books like Cat's Cradle can describe like just how terrible a nuclear holocaust would be and just how terrible it would be for people to live through that. We think it's really, really important for people to understand this, because the contrast that they have on their side of the house, where we only have utopian literature, is the idea that technology and like intellectual enlightenment and, you know, like progress is just unambiguously good and always leads to good results, right? We think this is dangerous because one, it's not true, and two, because the like misconception that this is the way that progress works and that this is the way that, you know, like science and technology works breeds complacency in the public. That is to say that they become a lot less critical about how social media is influencing the way they view politics. They become a lot less you know, concerned and critical about, you know, nuclear proliferation and the need to like stop those things. And they become a lot less you know, like scared about climate change and feel the urgent need to act on these particular issues, right? Recognize again that like not everybody in society has the benefit of being exposed to like, you know, like the intellectual ramblings of like Elon Musk or whatever, like academic from whatever university. We think that like both exposure to these stories and more importantly, the conversations that surround these stories, you know, all the like, you know, analysis and reviews and just like conversations with your friends and stuff about how you interpreted this movie and why you liked it or didn't like it are like how we actually like filter down to people in real society and get them to start like thinking about these problems, which OG never contested were actually problems. Very proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker for their remarks, and I invite the Deputy Prime Minister to close off opening government. Hear, hear.
Okay, I'm going to try to keep my camera on, but if I cut out, just tell me and I will stop that. Sorry, just 1 second. Okay, you can hear me? Great. It's funny how in a round where our side is literally defending utopia, it seems that opposition is the one living in a fantasy world. I'm going to chat about 3 things. First, on why we can't have both, so why one necessarily precludes the other. Secondly, I'm going to discuss why their side and our side doesn't have any impact for like science or advancement or changing social norms or anything like that. It's instead just about hedonistic pleasure. And then finally, I'm going to discuss, even if we think they do have some impact, how that still goes to our side. So first, why can't we have both? 4 reasons. The first is that because the narrative against tech is much, much more marketable. And so pessimism is brooded, and thus dystopia is much, much easier to observe. So for example, people are naturally skeptical at this point because the 4 reasons Naomi gave you, I'm gonna go over that a little bit later, but because of those reasons, they're naturally skeptical of technology, which means they're naturally less likely to buy into a utopic version of the world. This is perpetuated when they start reading dystopia, because then they're even more likely to get into a positive feedback cycle where they can't read utopia, or at least can't get the benefits that we talked about of escapism from utopia, because they always have that in the back of their head. Secondly, though, past critical recognition has always gone historically to dystopic works. Think like The Road that was nominated for a bunch of awards because people want to be edgy, for example, or Oryx and Crake, for example. Like just historically, those have gotten more critical recognition, and thus there is a positive feedback loop of more writers flocking to that field. This means that naturally there are more writers in this, and thus there are much, much more works in this field. Thirdly, though, when you read a single dystopia, you have that in the back of your head whenever you're reading a utopia. And then finally, as they say, there are more eyes to these stories because they're seen as more like shock value, like 1984 is really scary, really terrible for the world. And so given that shock value, you're much more likely to get press for those stories. Thus people are much more likely to read those stories, and thus they're more likely to get that very positive feedback loop. So this is why their only response to our claim that, you know, this is not exclusive is absolutely untrue. So why is it important for that? And why was it important that they didn't respond to any of our 4 reasons as to why people are unlikely to get any change on science from this or any societal change whatsoever? The first is the people who read these stories are largely children, right? Like these are largely young adult novels, think The Road, Oryx and Crake, think all of these stories. The point is that that's just generally the population who buys into any science fiction whatsoever, because adults are more into like real world fiction because they're more grounded in reality as a whole. So as they grow up, other factors start eating away at their myopic view of what the world looks like, of what technology looks like. So it looks like basically public intellectuals saying that technology can't actually do these things. It looks like realists like Neil deGrasse Tyson or Bill Nye. It looks like public accession and public anger at technology when any single thing goes wrong. That's the very fear-mongering that opening opposition chats about when they talk about how there's likely to be nuclear holocaust. No, there's probably not, like maybe 0.0001 or whatever % chance. But the point that they're even talking about it suggests that they're more scared than they should be. But finally, it's that tech and venture capital have massively low accountability. So even if there was this massive critical mass of people who were like, ah, yes, we need to make technology better and we'd have more technology, it's largely about the money going into that issue, not about random kids caring about that. But even if people did care about that, as they grow up, they get eaten away at. But finally, even if there was a large amount of people, you're not going to get like some tech voting block to change everything. Instead, you're much more likely to have basically the same things going on over and over again. This suggests to us that the only large impact in this round has to do with what the consumption of this media means. Given I already proved to you that there's only one way of consuming this media, so that is to say, if you consume one part of the media, it necessarily corrupts the other part of the media, we must have all of this being utopic, because if not, then we lose the valuable messages. CO says that like it's hard to market escapism. It's not hard to market escapism if every writer is just writing escapism, because then you don't need to market escapism, because then people are going to default to that utopic vision of the world. The important part of art is being able to remove yourselves from the tethers of the terrible reality in which you live. It's the fact that people want to reach beyond the bounds of COVID-19, the fact that they can't leave their homes anymore, the fact that the world is going to shit because of pandemics, because of potential nuclear holocaust, because of tensions in the Middle East, because of tensions in the West between China. There's just loads of really, really terrible things right now. And we need to give people an out, an ability to get some sort of redress from that, an ability to escape. We suggest that when OO agrees that escapism is valuable, but only contests whether it's exclusive, they also agree that this is a massive impact in the round. So since I proved it's exclusive, we can win on this impact alone. I'll take CO.
So if only reading one dystopian fiction is enough to ruin basically everything, I mean, previous works of dystopian fiction still exist. That doesn't go away.
Well, like, but they aren't in the public mainstream anymore. Like, people are much less likely to read them. And also into the future, when we get more readings and they kind of like fade into the limelight, out of the limelight, they're just much less likely to happen. So it's clear that we win on that alone. Secondly, though, I'd like to chat about what this means for the real world. They say that if there is change in the real world, it's going to be good from dystopic fiction, because it means that people are much more likely to notify problems that exist in the world, because that's what dystopic fictions address. We'd suggest two things. First, that it leads to a desensitization to the problem of the real world. So when you read about a massively, massively problematic work, for example, you read the absolute destitution that exists in the road. For example, when you read the destitution that exists in Oryx and Crake because of genetic engineering, you are desensitized to that problem. You believe that it can't possibly be that bad in our current world, because obviously it could get much, much worse. We don't think that people look to these fictions and are like, ah, yes, we should change all the things that are wrong with the world, because they don't see the current world in this. They see a world that is massively disconnected and distethered from that world that already exists. We think there are two potential outcomes to this. The first is if they actually connect the world, or the first is that they don't connect the world at all. So they don't really care. They don't think that this actually has any tether to reality. So they don't want to push for change. The second is that they do connect these dystopic pieces of fiction with the real world, and they shut off. As I pointed out, it's largely young adults reading these books. These are people who want to believe in a world that is good. They want to believe in a world that they can go into and they can have an impact on. We'd suggest that on their side, what just happens is they compartmentalize the harm. They think that it doesn't exist. They put it off. This is what has happened with many youth in the United States with climate change, where they think it's a real thing, but they just don't care about it because they don't want to put that amount of mental fortitude to thinking about a terrible, disgusting issue, because they don't give any hope to those individuals that there could be a possible solution. As Naomi pointed out, on our side of the house, we're much more likely to get change because we push back against anti-science narratives. I want to point out that OO even buys into those anti-science narratives. Obviously, there are potentials for harms that accrue from technology, but the point is that those harms are blown up in a society which says that 5G is causing COVID-19. They're blown up in a society that says your phone is being spied on every second of every day and everyone cares about exactly what you're doing. Instead, it would be much better if we had much softer narratives in our society towards technology. If we believed that solar panels were a genuine solution to the climate crisis, if we believed that tidal energy could be possible, even though there are some potential detriments, but the fact that this kind of fiction, dystopia, always has to emphasize the harms of the technology. The reason they always have to emphasize the harms of technology is because of those already pre-existing societal narratives. They have to buy into them to make it seem like a plausible conception of what that dystopia looks like. So on their side of the house, they necessarily have to take down technology, take down our only hope at a better future. We're very proud to propose.
I thank that member for their remarks, and I invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close off the top half of today's debate. Hear, hear.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Is this clear? Great. Give me a moment to organize my paper. Sorry. Okay. Starting in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. This debate isn't about dopamine. Opening government would love for individuals to all be drugged up on dopamine. They would love for them to escape the realities of the world so that they can be happier. But the fact is that after they close that book, they will have to return to the reality of the world, and those problems continue to fester regardless of if these individuals have an escape route or not. Media is significant in shaping the values of that individual person, and it affects the discourse that currently surrounds them. Opening government concede to this when they say, oh, it's young adults who are very impressionable, young teens who are very impressionable that consume this kind of media. That is why if you instill in them too strong of a sense of hope, they will not act in a way that is effective. These dystopian novels have been some of the most significant books of the last century. The Brave New World was one of the most important books of the last century. 1984 was one of the most talked about books and one of the most precise critiques of communism that was then talked about across classrooms around America, and is one of the reasons why you see a shaping of values and a shaping of discourse and the way that it exists. The second thing I like to note in terms of characterization is note the immense tension in the opening government case. Firstly, from PM, you hear these utopias are so fantastical. They're like Harry Potter. And then from DPM, you say, oh, but these utopias are actually really real. So it gives everyone a lot of hope about what the future could be. Harry Potter is not real enough for people to give hope of what the future could be. We posit to you a far more realistic scenario where these utopias describe certain ideologies, certain states of the world that are necessarily utopic in nature, and therefore are inextricably lied to the purity of that ideology in a way that is problematic. Talk three things in the speech. Firstly, on characterization and ground. Secondly, on individual dopamine. Thirdly, on social change or broadly social discourse. Firstly, on individual ground and characterization. So the first thing that they say is that these will be children reading these sorts of things, and that these characters still have to work through some hardship. Firstly, note that the end result of a lot of these utopias are one that are immensely hopeful, and the narrative is one that is that everything will be all right in the end. And this is brought into when they say that this is necessarily an escape from the world. Secondly, it's not children reading these things, presumably. Like no children reads like a really angry dystopian vision of the world. They read things like Cinderella. It's far more likely that it's young teens and young adults who are acclimated enough to, take on the problems of the world to some extent because they're already being introduced those problems in class in the first place, which is just that the harm that people face when they, read dystopian films are largely mitigated. The third thing to note about this characterization in particular is that given the vast majority of children's media is one that is immensely hopeful, you actually flip their point about where these individuals are necessarily socialized. Because what they say is all these individuals already believe in the hopelessness of the world. That's deeply unlikely. I think most 13-year-olds come into the year 13 believing that, oh, the world is actually all great because all I've read so far is Cinderella and Magic Tree House. But once they begin reading these, once they begin confronting the problems of the world, they realize the world is far more complicated. The DPM says a couple of things here. The first thing he says is that currently people are socialized against the problems of technology. Firstly, I would note that utopias and dystopias are not just about technology. They're also about things like political systems and things like that, or future versions of society that are necessarily incredibly plausible. The second thing to note is that given that people are already socialized to be hopeful because children's novels and media and parents do not isolate children or socialize children to be pessimistic to begin with, the individuals like the young adults who are entering these sorts of things are likely to get a correction. The second and third things he says is that these things are award-winning and they're shocking. All of this suggests that people enjoy these sorts of things and that they have a great deal of fun in consuming this sort of literature. And even if it's not the case that they achieve dopamine from consuming the literature, we would suggest that they achieve a far more fulfilling and profound degree of happiness by reading something that is actually critically engaging and something that they can actually relate to in a way that is meaningful, as aside from Magic Tree House, which is so fantastical that no one could ever conceptualize in the first place. The last piece of rebuttal to this, though, is that none of this explains as to why you still can't choose to be escapist if it's the case that you are so depressed that you want an escape anyway. Like, imagine the kind of person that they're talking about. They're talking about the kind of person who's so upset about the world, they're looking for any escape. Given that you want any escape, there are some utopian literature currently, and you can look for that utopian literature anyway. That was why their first argument was entirely uncomparative, because you still had the choice to escape in the instance in which you really, really wanted to. But secondly, we would suggest that, but given that most people don't want to escape and want to read something that actually reflects the current condition of the world, we suggest people can actually get more dopamine or more profound happiness by reading dystopian novels. Secondly, note that this is also broadly implausible because there's no reason as to why escapism will make you feel better than a reflection of your problems currently. That is, people don't watch film to be drugged in some meaningful way. They read books to be engaged and to actually think about things in a profound and meaningful sense. And we suggest dystopias that realistically portray the problems of of the world are far more likely to do that in a way that is meaningful. That is the reason why, on a consideration of dopamine, more people were happy under our side of the house because more people believed in those problems to begin with and didn't believe in the fantastical escapism of their side of the house. And secondly, to the extent that people wanted to believe in the fantastical escapism, they could still choose those anyway. Before I move on to talking about social effects and discourse, I'll take a point.
If people wanted to learn about the world, they can read the news or they could read nonfiction. Different people's identities are completely unique, and therefore different utopias resonate with different people. Given that, why is it not important to maximize the quantity of escapist media?
Okay, I got it. So the response to your first argument is that what Max explains to you precisely is that it is incredibly difficult to visualize the kinds of societies that we're talking about. It is difficult to visualize what the communist utopia would look like and why that is in fact a dystopia. And literature provides a unique ability to illustrate and characterize and make those impacts or make those characterizations visceral. The second thing to note here, though, is that in terms of problems, and this is one of the problems I'm going to get into now, the problem in the status quo is that people are broadly, like moderates and the vast majority of people, like teens in the status quo, are apathetic because they don't understand how significant of an issue climate change is. Even if the climate scientists, they say, understand like all the tech issues and all the tech billionaires do, the problem is the average individual cannot conceptualize or visualize what it means to their lives if it's the case that these problems do not go addressed sufficiently. And that is the reason why it is essential for these dystopian films to motivate individuals by giving them a concrete and visceral depiction of what these problems could necessarily look like. What they say is that this is going to cause learned like helplessness. It's going to make them so disconnected and feel so bad from the world and things like that. First response. Obviously, these people have already acknowledged that these problems exist, but crucially, the way dystopian films work, dystopian novels work, is not you tried but failed. It is you tried too late and so you failed. That's why dystopian novels do not lead to learned depression. It leads to things like a motivation to act right now, because you know if you act too late or you act too slowly, these problems will get out of hand in a way that is meaningfully harmful. And note that this method of negative reinforcement is far more motivating than their mechanism of positive reinforcement, because mechanisms of positive reinforcement are far more vulnerable to things like sliding into things like apathy or narratives or beliefs that, you know, everything will be all right in the end, whereas the belief that everyone needs to act right now, otherwise climate change is going to get horrible, is a much more powerful motivating factor. They say this only affects a small number of people. Number one, it affects the young adults who discuss these sorts of things, which is a lot of people. Secondly, it's formative of their opinions. And thirdly, even if it doesn't change the climate movement overall, we say it's broadly good to have more people engaging with the issues that they care about. That is the reason we oppose.
I thank that member for their remarks, and I invite the member of government to open up the back half of today's debate. Hear, hear.
Well, am I audible?
Yes.
Can I just get a second to sip some water? Before I begin, thanks Laura for partnering with me. Really cool that we made it this far. Now, with that said, 3, 2, 1. Panel, first, let's declare out why dystopias are relatively really unrealistic. I think that the problem with OO's case is that he wants to critique the society without actually analyzing what scientific dystopias actually look like, because their arguments are based around, okay, Brave New World and maybe 1984. But even those are really unrealistic depictions for 4 to 5 major reasons. Firstly, they rely on tech that literally doesn't exist in status quo, i.e. the kinds of tech that they rely on are not tech that will exist for at least the next 200 years, like 200 years, which means it's really difficult for there to actually be any form of realism. The second thing to say is that the kinds of governments that are portrayed are vastly unrealistic. That is to say that the kinds of ideological purities that they talk about sure exist to some degree, but we think that the kinds of mechanisms by which the government is controlling, for example, Big Brother mechanisms and stuff, are just very unlikely to exist in reality. Like, I think it's unlikely to goes out to every individual and hands them a pill like in Brave New World. Those kinds of things are just super unrealistic in terms of depictions. Third, it's just there's no explanation for how things even ended up in the first place in that dystopia. Like, it's unclear why it ended up like that, and so you don't know how to stop it, which means that all of their mechanisms that they talk about, like we're going to stop this, is literally impossible because you don't know what caused the dystopia within the science fiction world in the first place, right? The fourth thing to say is that these don't have happy endings, which is to say that even if you don't buy anything that I've said up until now, science fiction dystopias uniquely lead to bad endings for literally everyone. The problem then is that necessarily on their side of the house, they have to defend the idea of saying that there's a problem, but we're not going to provide you a solution. We fill in that gap when we tell you that hopeful fiction can still take from these ideas and lead to a proper solution and a mechanism. With that said, let's get into the other two. Let's get into what we think is particularly important in this debate. Firstly, on the kinds of societal change that happens, because I think OG sort of talks about this, but I think that this largely also takes out because on how we actually change the narratives that exist. Firstly, first thing to say is that the kinds of people who read this can be categorized in twofold. I think twofold. I think there's some adults reading this, and the large majority of adults who read this, by the way, are probably people from within the science field because they really enjoy this. But the other section that's reading this, which is probably the majority, are probably children. So why is this particularly impactful for children? Two reasons. Firstly, we think children tend to internalize narratives. That is to say that when I present you as a science fiction at a young age, as a 12-year-old, I think it's very likely that you internalize what that novel says, i.e. you're likely to believe in those kinds of things, but also by OG's own mechanization, I think it's just very likely that it can absorb in the world, which means that you remember it and it lasts for you for an extraordinarily long period of time. So why is this particularly important? Because at the point where you reinforce things like progressive views, things like the idea that hope can exist no matter how bad your situation gets, the people, when these individuals, when they actively grow up, are the kinds of individuals who push for things like social change or things that actually manifest in places of society. So what does this actually look like? When the government is actually committing some sort of like, I don't know, like governments pass bad policies all the time, these are the kinds of people who go out and engage in things like political activism or try to find solutions, because that's what this novel and their childhood literally taught them to do. The second thing to say is that the counterfactual is that literally you say to these children at that very vulnerable age that no matter what you do, you're always going to lose, i.e. even if you have the best possible rebellion, even if you do whatever, the government is always going to overpower you. When you internalize the narrative at the age of like 12, it's very likely that you are not the kind of person who pushes for state compliance. You're the kind of person who internalizes narratives that societal order matters and that the state should be pushing for these kinds of things. At that point, we tell you that you just get less social change, that you get less social mobility from individuals on the ground. The final thing to notice, why is this particularly important? Because these are individuals who are going to impact the future, which is to say that at the point where you internalize narratives at a particularly young age, they go with you throughout life, which means that on net, we probably get better social change on our side of the house. The second thing to say under this, the final thing to say under this is just on Wo's characterization of sort of how you can access like news and other on like critiques. Look, I think the way you access good critiques of society rather than sci-fi is that because sci-fi crowds out other proper critiques. That is to say that in status quo, when like civil rights movements are happening and stuff, I think it's not because I think those are the kinds of things you should probably be focusing on writing a book on. We think those kinds of books exist where they tell you why the government is currently really, really terrible or why a realistic government could be really, really terrible, rather than saying that a technological piece exists that is going to transport your brain or have pills. We think those kinds of things are not the kinds of dystopias we want to portray. We'd rather have a far more realistic portrayal while still accessing all of opening opposition's benefits. We don't think sci-fi is the right way to do this. The second strand on this is on scientists and why you create better hope for society. Look, I think at the point where scientists and other individuals are reading these, there's two things that happen. Firstly, you get inspiration for ideas in science, but the other thing, the more broad thing, is literally that we're able to portray narratives that convey hope. That is to say that at the point where I talk about saying that that X problem exists, for instance, this communist dystopia is really, really bad, or that there's a huge global war going on, but my protagonist actively solves for these things. For things like The Martian, you actively encourage things like coming up with solutions to problems and not being willing to accept the status quo. This is what encourages individuals to actively go out and change their problematic situations, which is to say that this encourages things like social movements and other formations that are particularly important. We think that never happens on opposition side of the house with the narratives that we talked about being internalized. I'll take OO if they have something right now.
Yeah, so given that it is the case that people are socialized initially to have positive views of political situations and positive views of tech, given all the advertising and the countervailing norms that we noted earlier, why is it not better to have a counter mechanism acting earlier to make those intuitions more realistic?
Okay. I think that the problem with that is just that by your own analysis, a ton of people read these kinds of books. But second, like it's far more easier to internalize dystopian critiques by your own mechanization, which means that contradicts the literal versions of your case. Like you literally tell me on one side that people internalize these really, really well and get into critiques for society, which means that people are able to internalize these and actively act on them and gain pessimism. Plus, people tend to remember suffering way better than like positive utopias. Like it's just a fact that if I stab your hand or like have you undergo any form of suffering or read about this suffering novel, it's just like you're far more likely to internalize those kinds of narratives far more than anything. Cool. The second thing I want to talk about is why this encourages minority representation in particular. Because notice that in status quo, when you're privileged, when you have like dystopian fiction, the kinds of individual represented are generally privileged individuals going about their daily lives. The problem is that this doesn't encourage progressive societal views to come forward. At the point where you have progressive scientific creators actually portraying utopias, two things happen. Firstly, we think that this leads to more minority representation. So this looks like, for example, The Shadow, where you have a black man inventing a time machine. When I read that kind of a book, I am far more likely to internalize minority narratives in particular, but also we think scientific creators probably have an obligation to encourage these minorities to take part in that. The second thing to notice is feminist narratives. We think you probably have women doing these kinds of things as well. We think the fact that a woman can go out, work, and do those and be a literal scientist or kick ass in our world means that you probably get all of these kinds of things in the status that opening opposition wants to talk about. We think they never access those because white privileged individuals are the ones who are represented primarily in dystopias. We don't think that that's the world we want to live in. Very proud to propose.
I thank that member for their remarks, and I invite the member of opposition to open up closing opposition. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, so in this speech, I will be repping the most critical work of dystopian fiction of our time, Minecraft. Okay, before I start my speech as well, I'd like to thank my partner, Luigi, for going on this magical journey with me into the wee hours of the morning and then just straight up 7 o'clock, and my family members are already eating breakfast. So, with everything said, I'll start my speech now. Okay. In this speech, I'll do three things. Firstly, I'll be explaining why neither total despair nor total hope are acceptable and why a balance is important. Secondly, I'll be explaining what the value of dystopian fiction in society is today. And thirdly, I'll be explaining why this is better on a thematic level, engaging with opening government in a way that opening opposition just kind of doesn't. So, firstly, as a matter of framing, I think opening government and closing government are both broadly correct in stating that total despair is bad, but total hope is probably bad too, since you can just hope for other people to take action and for the solutions that we need to fix things in society. So in response to that, then, I will explain why society has serious problems with overemphasizing hope in 4 key ways. Firstly, politicians try to downplay problems so that they don't look as bad, so that their performance during the term doesn't look as bad, and so that they're more likely to look good. Secondly, corporations need to have a good reputation, so they sugarcoat the harms that they contribute as well as the harms that their industry contributes. Thirdly, the media focuses on overemphasizing resilience because a prevalence of sad stories can cause media fatigue and reduces overall engagement. Fourthly, escapism is uniquely captivating public attention, which is like most of Gov's arguments. So for all the reasons they mentioned, people will naturally gravitate towards escapism, which is why this feedback loop from opening Gov doesn't make sense, and which is why there are natural inclinations towards developing this literature and reading this literature. This means that in the same way that there are some tendencies towards accentuating despair, there are also some tendencies towards accentuating hope. Therefore, the solution is not a total destruction of one or the other, but rather addressing the clear problems of society's attitudes towards optimism and pessimism, and not exclusively picking just one. So that resolves most of that. I actually think that deals with like top half's entire contention about whether or not people will do something or nothing. Like in one side, people will do something, and one side people will do something else. The most important thing is that representation in action towards the future needs to be balanced so that we can critique both sides. Moving on. Before I move on to the point about what dystopian fiction importance for society is, some more direct refutation to the previous speaker. Firstly, the previous speaker says that you'll get minority representation and feminist narratives. Now, just saying that The Handmaid's Tale and The Scarlet Letter were dystopian like pieces of work should be enough to destroy this. But I just want to point out that dystopian fictions can also critique what a world with racism looks like and what a world where we prioritize one race looks like. Like Brave New World was all about eugenics and the problems it had for people. So I broadly think that this is just untrue, and in fact, dystopian fiction is probably more effective at critiquing these kinds of things. The second point I will respond in extraneous response is their point about how dystopias are unrealistic, so it's not very captivating for individuals. The first thing is utopias are about as unrealistic for the same reasons that they give. except for the bad endings point. I'll respond to that later. The second thing, though, is I think dystopias are important because they examine how realistic people with very real lives, react to unrealistic circumstances. Now, I am sure that a book about robots stealing the jobs of factory workers was unrealistic a few decades back, but guess what? It's a problem now, and it was something that people had needed to consider. We genuinely think that when you examine these people, it's important, like, it's just interesting in a thematic sense, like examining the lives of people in like Star Wars, for example, or like the grim darkness of the 40th century, right? Like, but in addition to that, it also means that we get to examine just what people would look like in a hypothetical system, which might end up badly, and that's also probably a good thing. Now, moving on to dystopian fiction. There are three characteristics. First is that there are clear and notable flaws in society. Secondly is that some of them pretend to be utopias at first, but slowly uncover the cracks in an otherwise perfect edifice. The third and most important characteristic of dystopian fiction is that it is heavily political and influences policy. Here's where we broadly respond to OG saying nothing will change, which is also kind of contradictory to their point about how, oh, something will change in a bad way against innovation. AI critics right now are informed because of Isaac Asimov in 2001: A Space Odyssey that captivated their attention as children and distilled ideas into accessible form. Phrases from Orwell's 1984, such as Big Brother, doublethink, and even just calling something Orwellian, enter modern political discourse. Many people are taught these things in high school literature. Like the phrase book burner comes from Fahrenheit 451. I just very basically think that this informs people's attitudes towards technology as well as towards governments as a whole, and we broadly think that's good in two key respects. The first way it's good is that when they internalize these narratives, they are forced to compare it to all the utopian narratives they are sold, not just in books, but by politicians, but by individuals that promise to sell them a reality, oh, by passing this policy, we'll be able to fix your problems. What dystopian fictions can do is deconstruct the realities that you are proposed to by society and that you are told to hope for. The second reason why it's important, and I think opening Gov is like, well, you can't incite change because venture capital doesn't care about the whims of people. Yeah, but you can probably advocate for some broad regulation from the state. You could probably advocate for some response to automation. You could probably advocate for some realistic response to these things. Notably, we've also disproven OG's mech, since there are other mechs that rely on asking things to change for individuals or preventing the worst excesses of science fiction, rely on science fiction to motivate these people in the first place and to make it accessible to people. Therefore, dystopian fiction makes life easier for people as well as just makes the world overall safer. The second thing I will engage with is on thematic ideas of happiness. But before that, just a brief response to why they can't read the news. Well, the first thing is that, one, the news isn't art. It doesn't provide a compelling narrative about what the future might be like, and it doesn't humanize it to individuals. The second thing is it allows us to understand humanity through a different lens. We need depictions of societies gone wrong and societies gone right so that we can compare where they were different and pick where society went right. Even if you know all the ways that society went right, you cannot possibly compare that to all the possible ways it could have gone wrong, how a single mess up might have changed the world entirely, how like pressing the wrong button could have caused nuclear war. So it's important to compare these things because it's only valuable insofar as there is some comparison between the two. The last thing here is on thematic ideas of happiness. So the first thing is I want to point out that there are still small happinesses inside a dystopia, like The Giver and Hunger Games and other novels create an interesting dynamic where even in a world that is unforgiving, people can still find happiness there. This is important because many stories take place after the end of the world and demonstrate human life in these places, so like Metro Last Light or Fallout. We need people to be emotionally prepared for bad things to happen to them because sometimes bad things happening to them on a societal wide scale that could be seen as the end of the world or approaching a dystopia is important. If there are psychological problems that happen with your expectations being broken, like just by reading a book, imagine how much worse it will be if you're unprepared for it in actual life when like a robot takes your job or something terrible happens to you as an individual. We think people are way more adjusted on our side because they have prior experience to what it might be. And note, old dystopian fiction isn't enough because it won't accommodate for the new problems and the new future problems we might project now. So at the end of this speech, we should win for two reasons. The first is that GovBench generally says people romanticize despair. We put to you that people also romanticize hope, and thus you need a balance between the two. The second thing is that it's just really good for society. And the third thing is that you have more thematic ideas of happiness. As a parting note, if you do this motion, you don't get Star Wars. That sucks. So, again, thanks.
I thank that member for their speech, and I invite the government whip to close off the gov half of today's debate. Hear, hear.
Cool. All right. I guess before I get started, One, thank you to all the Hopkins team people that are here. It definitely means a lot. Secondly, thank you to Muzzy for both partnering with me. I know we've come a long way since Northam's 1-5. And for my first VP tournament, it's certainly been a ride, but I'm glad we've been able to take them one round at a time. Okay. Is everyone ready? First, I'm going to respond to the material that came out in CO, and then after that, sort of just two broad questions to the round. I think CO almost gets there when they say that the solution to sci-fi is not this mix of total happiness and total despair. Just like situations and people's attitudes probably lie in the middle. However, while CI might get a good insight into sort of the ideas and the characterization that people need to experience when they read sci-fi, they don't explain how good critiques happen, and they don't beneath the material that came out in Muzzy's speech. Why is this the case? Because we tell you explicitly in our speech that dystopias are inherently unrealistic. Dystopias explain what happened. They never explain why it happened, why you got to this place. Also, they never explain to you like how you're sort of able to bridge this technology gap, i.e. that like dystopias often have this future technology or future monolith of society or just conditions unrealistic to the place that we got now. This is important, right? Because even if the stuff by their best case is sort of related to what we have now, they never explain how we get to that point, i.e. what caused the mistakes in the first place, which means that we're never able to critique ourselves because like their same analysis of why dystopias are unrealistic because they're inherently different from reality is the same like analysis that happens on the negative side. How do we solve for that though, right? I think the best thing that we hear out of OG is this broad idea of, oh, you have hope now when you read sci-fi. That means you could go out and solve something. No, it's not about the hope. What actually happens, what's the biggest impact when you read sci-fi books is the problem solving, the analysis skills. Like you see this good situation or you see a problem that has been overcome and you understand how to break down and how to solve it. When the Martian, right, when they were building up potatoes or building up their agriculture system, you understand sort of what specific techniques he did, what specific mechanisms, what scientific process he did in order to get to that solution. This is the most tangible impact because irregardless of if the world is shitty or the world is good, having problem solving skills, having disaggregation techniques means that you're able to better yourself and continue on towards progress irregardless of what your current mental state is now. I think that beats a lot of the opening half and takes out the first half of CO's speech. But let's continue on to what they say. When they say, talk about like feminism minorities and say like dystopias can also do a critique too, and like they can also show minorities. No, this is fucked up on a couple of things. Realize that broadly in dystopian or just sci-fi literatures in general, right? The main characters to be affected are those on the margins, i.e. like minority characters in particular. This is why you have the trope of, oh, the black guy always gets killed first in like a sci-fi movie, right? Because those are the ones particularly affected. Those are the ones that exacerbate the problem and like the problems and the sort of the struggles of a dystopian society. This is important to say then, because realize that any dystopian narrative, in order to show the struggles, either one plays into stereotypes, which hurts these minority like representations because it just plays into their character tropes, or two, it serves as reaffirmation for people reading those who had those negative beliefs before and now read the book and see, oh, this is probably what happened, you read it, and because of that, they're not able to advance in society. This is important then to show what happens in our side of the house when we put minority characters and particularly the feminist movements in sort of a prominent role. Here, we show that one, these people are able to think critically, they're able to think of and come up with scientific inventions. When Muzzy gives you that example of a black man inventing a time travel machine, this shows you sort of that everyone is equal, everyone has the same intellectual curiosity, but two, it also shows that people are capable of doing kick-ass stuff in especially a unique intellectual genre such as science fiction, which you might not get in a other more like less technical based genre, for instance, like rom-com or drama or comedy or something like that. This is important then because we can show both those most marginalized as those most important, contributing to society equally, and that when everyone continues and everyone contributes to intellectual capital, they're able to advance. Okay, cool. But in the last part of the CEO speech, what do we hear? A couple of things. Here, we hear that like people's attitude towards tech means that like people are still adjusted, they're able to adapt to society. I think I beat a lot of this earlier on when I preempted by saying maybe by their best case scenario, people might be able to relate to dystopia a little bit more. Maybe they're not totally hopeless or maybe they're not totally hopeful, but they don't know how to solve it. They don't know how to get out of their situation. And it is that inability to solve and inability to get out, which is what creates a learned helplessness over time. This is the unique analysis that OG doesn't provide, but Muzzy excellently gives you in his speech. Okay, cool. Now, two main questions in the round, and how do we clearly win? One, I touched upon this idea first, but this idea of like consumption and internalization, because realize when someone reads the science fiction themes, they're not broadly thinking, especially because they're children, like the deep metaphysical connections of the universe and the deep broader themes. They're not really thinking on that sort of level. Everyone can see this when they admit that children read books. What is the most likely way that people get consumed, or do they most likely perceive? We think it is the actual characters themselves, the dialogue that they say, the words that they interpret, the actual like actions that they take. This is one, easier to see because they are like doing it themselves. You don't need a secondary analysis. But two, it is also the most visible, the most jarring. I might remember like Harry Potter himself or like Luke Skywalker because I remember the character, not necessarily the themes of the underlying stuff behind it. This is the unique warranting given. This is important then, because so long as we can prove that minority characters and feminist characters are the ones actively in power, actively contributing at the forefront, rather than the ones first killed off in a movie, that means that people remember this war, which means that when they go out and they treat people in real life, they aren't sort of, they are treating people with more respect, with a sense of more dignity, and that is good. This is important. This uniquely outweighs OG's analysis of, oh, we need to stop people from thinking COVID-19 vaccines are paranoid, because we think a lot more people, very few people actually believe like they have the tinfoil hat over their head. Rather, it's this implicit action, this societal behavior, which broadly influences people, especially since this is uniquely outside of science fiction. Like how we treat people, how we treat racial justice is independent of science. Okay, cool. With the last part of this, actually, I'll take OO right now.
Are there more people in the world who have read 1984 or who are aware of some of like the terms and tropes and discussions around 1984 and how they apply to problems in our current world?
Honestly, I don't know which one 1984 is. I'm not a big science fiction reader. But what I do know is that when people read a book, they internalize the behavior based on that book. So at that point, you get a networking effect, at which point it is good to sort of have these discussions and have this positive behavior, because then you get a signaling and a giant amplification effect of having good behavior. Okay, cool. The last part of my speech I want to talk about is societal change and how change actually manifests. It does not happen because you either see a problem and you think, oh shit, this problem happened, but I don't know how it happened. I know how it like started, so I'm going to do something, right? That isn't how change works. It also isn't how change also like doesn't result because you now have hope or you now have a sense of optimism. Rather, change happens when you know how to break down a problem. You're able to see thought processes and you're able to work through someone's logic. This is how people are able to start thinking about problems, not just within science fiction, but within other sectors too. And this is the unique analysis that Moisey gives you. This is what separates science from religion, right? Because there's not just a blind hope in something to get better, but it is rather the critical thinking and the research skills that clearly outweigh us over every other contribution this round. Very proud to propose.
I thank that speaker for their remarks, and I invite the opposition whip to close out this debate. Hear, hear.
Hello, testing my microphone. Can I be heard properly?
Yes, you can.
All right, thank you. All right, I'm going to start my speech in a few seconds. A POI is to be raised in the chat. I'm gonna watch the chat, no problem. Okay. So our case at closing opposition is simple. Dystopian fiction is the most anti-establishment and anti-centrist literature that balances against the commercialization and romanticization of hope that is brought by those in power. It is the best comparison point that we need if we have both utopia and dystopian fiction. There are two issues I'm going to focus on in this speech. Number one, what is the purpose of science fiction and in this context right now? And secondly, what does this mean for our framing of crisis in the real world? Firstly, what should the purpose of science fiction be? So opening government creates this self-imposition at the start of this debate, that this debate is a low-impact debate, and the most important impact that matters is the personal escapist value that reduces anxiety and emphasizes collectivism. There are a few responses I want to highlight this as to why they undermine their own value. Firstly, if this is the case, then you also cannot believe the arguments of anti-innovation, because people still have incentives to solve real-world problems now and future problems existing in the future because they manifest today. But also you can also believe the argument on conspiracy theories, because these are still likely to have incentives to be able to conduct misinformation outside of of fiction novels to undermine academic institutions, to undermine scientists for, competitive profit, or to be able to instigate disorder or chaos. But the second reason is this, right? If it is more so about personal emotional reactions, which I do understand from opening government is definitely the most important value of this debate, a more valuable reaction in this debate is the visceral reaction of the feeling of hopelessness, the feeling of unease, the feeling of insecurity, the challenge of status quo, and the comfort that they experience. And this is different from just news in general, because echo chambers exist to be able to at least portray some news as biased, to portray news as certainly politically motivated, or at least to undermine, or at least to take away and discredit certain news sites and news sources as well. At least we would like to show that this fiction absolutely looks and defends the worst case. That it's not just to tell you that you should do something, like what opening opposition says, that it's dystopia being good in general, but it provides you an important reference point against utopia, or at least your understanding of utopia and reality as it should ideally be. But you, as a generation, frame this as something that is a benchmark for you for what the worst case can be, for our forecasting for the future that is caused by a previous generation. And that is the unique system of accountability and the unique system of blame against establishment institutions, against politicians who are able to sell a narrative of hope and resilience to individuals. And that is why the context given by David was very powerful. We talked about not just saying that opening opposition talked about that people have an innate incentive to be optimistic, but it is that people in power, even amidst crisis, have commercial, political, socioeconomic incentives to try and brainwash you into thinking that even if we're going into worse and worse economic situations, we are actually getting better. This is because they have incentive to stay in power. This is because corporations want to maintain their reputation. And it is because people want to dissuade and give you short-term temporary relief and be able to think that you are going to have a better life in the next few years, even if we are structurally getting worse in the next 10 or 50 in the future. And this is why we say that this short-term discounting that is caused by the commercialization of hope is actually disproportionate, it is unfair, it is undemocratic, and it's probably something that is very difficult to you. What fiction does is it transcends that commercialization. It transcends the ability of politicians to be able to, do this temporal discounting or the changing of your expectations. What it does is that a story with a child, as what closing government says, it stays with you as you grow older. It is something that stays with generations in the same way crisis stays with particular generations. What this uniquely does is it allows you to give an important reference point that you can use the solutions that are provided by utopian novels for the problems in dystopia. And it is necessary for this disjunct to exist in society, because I do agree with closing government. They are unrealistic to a certain extent, but that is why it is important that this unrealistic narrative continues to exist, because people have that reference point. The last response I want to give is this. Sci-fi is uniquely good for forecasting and managing your expectations. And closing government can't say that utopia suddenly becomes realistic while dystopia is inherently unrealistic. That is simply untrue. They both have certain degrees, and both of them have certain exaggerations of the counterfactual in either side. What does matter, however, is that we can specifically point to not just the accuracy of this technology, because I do agree, both sides are going to have inaccurate technology no matter what, but it is about the attitudes you create and instill in individuals. And we say the attitude of being antagonistic or skeptical against certain establishment and centrist institutions that want to commercialize hope against you is important to counterbalance against these mechanisms that exist today. This is a unique contribution given by closing opposition. And that's why we conclude the issue as to why the purpose of science fiction is not just trying to say that you will give and reduce anxiety, because that anxiety usually will go away after the crisis subsides because of people trying to reassure you. But what science fiction uniquely does is it sustains your ability to be skeptical against these institutions that are in power. I'll take opening government.
Populist politicians are often pessimistic and harp back to old times that were better. They can be called out by political opponents. They cannot lie about the lived realities of COVID. Even if this does impact our societal perceptions, it corrects for an overbalance of pessimism that is necessary for hope and innovation that we mechanized.
No, so I don't believe that to be true. Populist leaders right now, even as amidst the their going crisis, try to dissuade accountability and blame against themselves and put it against other administrations. So yes, they were in the worst of times before, but now they are improving. That's why Donald Trump says we are, regaining all of our jobs and we are continuously improving our economy. Our economy is continuously booming, and people are still going to try and believe that to a certain extent. He's still winning in the polls right now because people think that he's still running the economy in a really good way. The second issue is this: what does this this mean for our framing of crisis in the real world? So what I want to point out is that crisis uniquely are flashback moments for previous generations. Like most of us will remember 9/11, most of us will remember the financial crisis, and most of us will remember COVID-19 for the rest of our lives. However, it is easy to assume that these things are overcome in a very easy way. For example, you might think that the vaccine might be a panacea to all future pandemics. You might think that certain crises can be alleviated because you are able to get a job and now your job is restored, or you're given some healthcare insurance in the short term. What dystopian fiction does, like if you believe that there is an impact to this debate, what it does is that it affects people even during neutral times. It affects people and the expectations that they have, even if they have short-term relief that they may experience, that people may get some alleviation, people might have some innovation like a vaccine, but people are still having worser expectations in the future. Like, I think this is a more unique contribution because we gave you the structural analysis as to why the expectation has to be reliant on both reference points existing, on a utopia existing, but also a dystopia consistently being pervasive as well. We talked about language being accessible, we talked about the thematic analysis that comes from it, and we talked about how this critiques establishment institutions uniquely because of this. For all this and more, because we talked about what this science fiction can uniquely do, if you talk about how it relates against the structures that try to brainwash you in other ways outside of science fiction, I am very proud to end this debate.
I thank that speaker and everybody else for a great debate. I invite all of the speakers and the audience to leave this Zoom call so that we can deliberate. We will give you your, I think it's going to be back in Discord. So if you join back the GA,